How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another Web Dev Junkie video. My name is Cody Seibert, and in this video, I want to kind of talk about the bare minimum you want to learn when you're like coming into using React and you're a beginner. Because if you look through these docs, there's quite a bit of stuff, and a lot of the stuff is probably not even useful to know about as a beginner. I mean, I'll be honest with you all. I'll tell you a little secret. I don't know probably half of this stuff. But I've been on a project using React for the past 1 year and a half. We have 300 JSX components. We got a lot of code, right? And there's only a small amount of hooks and other things that we actually do in our application. So with that being said, I should say that for our state management, we use something called Cerebral. So that kind of might remove the need to learn stuff like use context, which we don't use anywhere in our app. But if you want to use context to actually store your state in your React app, feel free to. And again, this is just a beginner like checklist of things you want to learn, right? So there's a lot more you can learn, but I think if you learn these things right here, you can hit the ground running with quite a bit of functionality and start learning stuff along the way. So the first thing is the functional component. I'm not going to be doing the class type construction of a component. I'm just going to be dealing with functional, and I suggest that's what you start with. And we might go over more than 5 minutes, so ignore this React in 5 minutes directory. So functional components. Basically, your React app is built up of various different JSX components. And that allows you to easily abstract different logic, such as if you have a table, every row could be its own JSX component where you define what a table looks like and whatnot. Or you could have like a React card, right? You could have a card JSX component. So to create one, honestly, all you have to do is just make like a card JSX file, and you want to use the functional approach. So you simply just export, and then you could say const card is equal to a function. And that is basically it. Inside here, you need to make sure you return some type of HTML. So I'll return a div that says I'm a card. And at this point, we have a JSX component. Notice that whenever you make a component like this, you do need to make sure you import React. So I'm going to go ahead and import React at the top of this JSX component. And at that point, you should be able to import your card component in any other JSX file or React file and use it. So if I just say import card from /card, and then I try to render it here. Okay, so I just render it as a typical like HTML tag or element. Now, if I go to my app, notice that it says I'm a card. So that was very easy to do. We made a JSX file, we export a function, and that function needs to return some HTML. Okay, and then inside app.js, we just simply import it. And you could do the same approach in any of your JSX files, right? I could import other components, and those components import other components, and it just kind of goes down the tree, and it helps you split up your app and make it more modular. So that is the gist of doing functional components. There are probably other things I could talk about, but I mean, as long as you know how to create them and import them, you've already made like a huge increase in your ability to code in React. So I'll just go ahead and I guess I'll delete that. Functional components we took care of. Now props. Props are basically the ability to pass in arguments to a React component, right? So again, behind the scenes, this card component is just a function. So you remember here, we just made a card variable and set it equal to a function that returns HTML. So inside of here, you have something that is passed in called props. And basically, these are the properties that you attach to your top level definition of your HTML JSX component, if that makes sense. So you know how in HTML you can define different attributes here, so like class name. Well, I can pass props into my component here, and those are basically just passed in into my function. So if I actually close this and split this in a new, if I were to pass something like name and then say like hello, I can use that. So I can say I am a props.name. And now if I go back to my app, it'll say I am a, let's see, I forgot to save my app.js, so I'll do that. And it says I'm a hello. So we basically covered props. That's all you need to know. You can pass in properties into your JSX components, and those get passed in up here. And sometimes what you'll see is we'll actually just define using object deconstruction here and just grab name directly from that argument. And on the left, you could wrap those in curly braces if you want to instead like do some type of like in string interpolation, something like that. So now it says I am hello Bob. That basically covers props. And you could pass whatever you want in here. You could do strings, ints, arrays, objects, whatever, and that'll be sent to your function down here. You can use it when rendering HTML. One thing I did not put on this list is basically how do you interpolate stuff to the HTML, and that is the single curly braces. So you probably have noticed by now, I didn't really explain it, but to get those properties or get string or text to write out to your DOM elements, you simply just wrap them in these single quotes here, these single curly braces. So that pretty much covers props. There's probably a little bit more I can cover on those, but that is the gist of it. You can pass stuff into your subcomponents and use them. And that can go down and down and down. You can also pass functions in, which I didn't already talk about. But as long as you understand that concept, you pretty much have covered properties. So events. I've looked through my actual production code. We have 300 JSX components, and these 3 events were pretty much the only ones we used. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe we're not utilizing some stuff, but most of the stuff on an app is when you click on it, you need to do something custom. But I mean, you could do like on click, on hover, on blur, on change. On change is used for like input boxes and text boxes, so it's really important to use that one. And on blur, we typically use for validation. So if you type into a text area and you tab out, you need to run validation to remove some like red warning text. But again, these are the 3 events that we pretty much only use in our app. So let me just show you a couple of those. So let's say you wanted to have an event listener on the card, and when you click it, you do something, okay? So I could, inside of this card component, I simply say on click, and I can call some type of function here. So I could say a function called print hello, and I will make a function up here. So const print hello is a function that simply console logs hello. All right, so let's verify this works. I'll open up my console down here, and I will click on the card. And notice that as I click, it's printing out hello down here. So that is the gist. I mean, you can change it to on blur or on change, depending on if it's like a text area or if it's something that you actually want to listen to. But events in React, you basically just define them like this. It's an attribute, camel case, you set it equal to some type of function. And sometimes what you'll see in React is you'll do these fat arrow calls if you need to like do something with the event and pass it to your function. But a shorthand is just basically pass that function here and call it. Now, sometimes you want to be able to call a function that's declared at a higher level when we click on the card here. So what you can do, I can make a function called onCardClicked. That's a function, again, that just prints hello. Oops, do the curly braces. And instead of having that print hello here, we can say, have it taken a prop called onClicked. And basically, when we click on that card here, we call the property onClicked. But we haven't passed it in here onside that card here. So I'll just go ahead and say onClicked and call onCardClicked. Go ahead and just go back to the view with this. And now, again, if I refresh this page, or it should have already automatically refreshed, as I click on this, it's the same logic. It's printing out hello, but the difference is instead of it being nested in this card JSX, my function is here. So that's really good if you have like top level state and you want your subcomponents to change state when you click stuff. You could just define the function here, pass it around to your subcomponents or your children components. They can call and change state as needed, and that is pretty much how you solve that. And again, I didn't cover on blur or on change, but they're pretty straightforward. You should be able to look up the docs to figure out how those work. And then the last thing that you need to know as a beginner learning React would be hooks. Since we're using functional components, sometimes you need to like know when your component was created or mounted, right? So one of the important hooks is useEffect. I probably should have started with useState, but I'll just do useEffect. So for an example, when our card component is mounted to our screen, we might want to like make an HTTP request to grab some data from a backend or do something special with some data. And one way you can do that with hooks is to use something called useEffect. So you can import that up here from the React library. And inside of your JSX function, it has to be inside of this function here. You can call useEffect, and that takes a callback. And then your second argument would be an array of your dependencies or props that you need to listen for. Okay, so what this does, if I were to call useEffect and pass it an empty array, this is equivalent to when your component mounts. So basically, like when it first is created and put onto your DOM, it's going to run some code and it runs it only once. So I could say we are here and go back, refresh the page, and notice that it prints out we are here. And it only ever prints that out once. So again, this is really useful if you want to just fetch some initial data from a backend or do something once when the component is created. But you sometimes want the ability to refetch stuff from the data or from like a database or from a backend whenever a particular thing changes. So let's say we had an endpoint that grabs me all of the songs a person has liked. Okay, so let's say that whenever the component name or whenever the name property changes on this card component, we want to refetch like all the artists that that person enjoys listening to. So instead of an empty array here, we could simply pass in name. And now whenever name changes inside of the upper level component, so instead of hello Bob, what I could actually do is I could set a timeout. I'm actually going to use effect here. So useEffect, this is a little bit, this is kind of advanced, but not really. So again, useEffect. And what I'm trying to do is just basically set a timeout or set an interval. And every second, I'm going to go ahead and change hello Bob to something. But we haven't actually talked about state yet. So let me just go ahead and dive into setting state really quick. So sometimes in your components, I'm kind of combining effect and state, so stay with me. I'm trying to demonstrate like when stuff properties change, but unfortunately it's hard to do that unless you have state. So let's say we wanted to have this name stored inside a state somewhere. Well, another effect we can use is called useState. And what you can do is when you're inside of your JSX component, you can declare an array that has two indices. And inside of the first index is going to be your state, and then your second index is a function you can call to change that state. So I'm going to call useState, and I'm going to pass it null. Actually, in fact, I can call it like hello Bob. The argument that you pass to useState is the initial state of this variable here. So let's take a step back as a recap. When I run this, name is going to be set to hello Bob, and I have a function that I can change name by just simply calling set name somewhere. So I can say set name July or something like that. Okay, and that'll change name to July. But what we're trying to demonstrate here is that name can actually come from state, and we can pass it to our card component. And when, let me get rid of all this click stuff because we already talked about that. And it's not that important at this point, so. Again, we're just trying to talk about state and also the useEffect. So when this app component mounts, we set an interval, and every second we want to set name equal to, I'll say Bob and add a random string. So math.random. And this is just so that card will just keep on rerunning this console log every time name changes here. So I think if everything is set up correctly, I should be able to go back to my app and notice that every time the name changes, that is going to be re-rendered in our app component. I mean, in our card component, because that is passed down. And then we also have a useEffect, which is going to run every single time the name changes. And this is really, again, really useful for whenever you need to like dynamically fetch different data when stuff changes. But I think in our app, the majority of the times we use the useEffect hook, we're using it like this. So like whenever the app component mounts, whenever the JSX component mounts, do something once, and that's it. And it's good for setting up like lower level JavaScript event listeners, like add event listeners to DOM elements and stuff. Right. So again, I kind of combine two concepts at once, but if you useState is really easy. Obviously, you just, I mean, it's not easy. It's going to take some time to learn, but it's easier than useEffect. But again, you can pass whatever type of JavaScript data type to useState. That's going to return an array that has two elements in it. And the first element is going to be your variable that's storing the state, and your second element is going to be a function you can call to change the state. And useEffect takes a callback as the first argument, and the second argument is your array of properties that you want to check to see if they changed. Now, one thing I did not talk about, let me just go ahead and clear out some of this stuff. Sometimes when the component is cleaned up, so unmounted and destroyed, you want to also clean up some code that's inside of your actual component here. So what you can do inside of useEffect is return yet another function, and this nested function, or I should say this returned function, is invoked on cleanup, or unmount, I guess you could say, if you're kind of coming from a traditional class approach. So again, this is, let's say, when your component mounts, you load in a file, you have a file blob, you add that to state somewhere, and when the component unmounts, or when you kind of like change routes to something else, you need to clean up that blob because you don't want like a megabyte file sitting around on your DOM tree. So you might want to clean up files, blobs, other things. And you might not use this that much. Oh wait, clean up event listeners. So if you're like listening to stuff, you might want to do some type of event listeners cleanups. So that was useEffect and useState. I think the last one is useRef. So sometimes you want to actually access your, like the lower level DOM element inside of your app. So let's get rid of useEffect and just move on to something else. Let's see, let's go to card and let's talk about the useRef. So if for whatever reason we need to access the actual like div DOM element and inside the JavaScript DOM tree, you can actually put a ref here. And up here you can say const let's see, div ref is equal to useRef. And I could say pass that here. So now I actually have a reference to what this div is. So if I wanted to go back and say on click, I don't know, change styles, and I have a function that says const change styles is equal to this, I just print out div ref here. So anytime I click on this div here, we're going to have access to that underlying DOM element. So if I click on this, we have an object that has current on it, and you can say div refs.current, refresh that page, and now when I click on it, we actually have the div. Okay? So what that allows us to do is, I believe, there might be something I might be forgetting, but I think you can actually like access the underlying DOM properties of that. Okay? So this is just a DOM element. Div ref.current.style. So if I wanted to like change the color of text to, I don't know, red, whenever someone clicks this, you can do it like that. Okay, and I'm not recommending that you use the useRef hook for manually manipulating the DOM, like manipulating style, but there are some instances where you need to actually grab that div and do something. It's not that often. Like this is why I left this one for last, because useRef is not as important as all those other things I covered. But yeah, that is, I'm gonna wrap this tutorial up. I went pretty fast. So if I lost anyone, I'm sorry. I could probably make a slower one, but I was trying to just give you an overview of the most important beginner React concepts or functions that you need to learn to achieve like 80 or 90% of everything you might need to use. And again, just to drive that fact home, we have a app that we've been working on, has 300 JSX components. We've been working on this app for like a year and a half now, a team of 8 or 9 developers, and these are the main things that we've seen to the app. There's one or two other things that I haven't talked about, but they're not really used that often. But these are probably the things that you need to actually understand. So if you're a beginner, you might feel overwhelmed. A lot of stuff you could learn in React. If you look through the docs, they talk about like creating classes and then like doing lifecycle hook mounts and stuff like that. But you don't need to be overwhelmed because really there's just a small subset of things that if you learned, you can build a majority of what you are trying to build. So I'm going to wrap up this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching again. This is Web Dev Junkie, and my name is Cody Seibert. If you have comments, questions, or concerns, be sure to post them in the comments section below. And like always, be sure to like and subscribe to this video if you enjoy this content. All right, have a great day.